QSO Today, episode 334, Tim Deagan KJ8U. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you in this new year to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver, now shipping from your favorite amateur radio dealer. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Flex Radio is one of the two platinum sponsors of the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that will return in March 2021. If you and your company would like to be the second platinum sponsor, please contact me. The next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is right around the corner. We are finalizing our list of speakers, introducing new technology to make the virtual expo experience the best it can be. Stay tuned for informative email messages from us as the expo unfolds. Tim Deagan KJ8U loves to build just about anything to try out a new tool. And Tim has an amazing assortment of tools to aid in his construction of amateur radio antennas, as well as propane-powered visual displays that you'd find at Burning Man out in the California desert. KJ8U is a maker, and since ham radio operators were the original makers, Tim's crossover between the maker community and the amateur radio community is just natural. Tim tells his story in this QSO Today. KJ8U, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Tim?
4Z1UG, this is KJ8U. This is Tim. Doing great. How are you today?
I'm great, Tim. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Absolutely. I had always been aware as a child of ham radio, but really didn't have any access to it and had been curious, but didn't really understand the path to get there. And it really wasn't until the mid-90s, in 1995, when a friend of mine and I decided, when the no-code technician class license became available, we decided that was probably the last barrier that we should let stand. And so we both decided to dare each other to study for and get our technician's licenses. So in 95, I got my technician's license as KC5QFG. And my goal at that time was primarily packet. I really didn't have any connection with the ham community here in Austin, Texas, or hams elsewhere. I was working at Dell Computers. I was a hardware designer at the time and starting to become a software designer. And I was very interested in network communications over the air and alternate paths. So packet, which was opening up, was really exciting at that time. It wasn't very long before the internet made it less and less interesting. It just didn't have the viability or the necessity. I was doing phone patch and things like that on, VHF, and that was pretty exciting until you had a cell phone in your pocket.
Auto patch is what we used to call it in those older days, right? But let's go back even farther. I'm looking at you on video conference right now, and I'm looking at your shack, and if anybody goes online and starts looking you up, Tim, then it's obvious that you have a lot of interests that are highly technical, require a fair amount of expertise that you've built up over a lifetime. So let's go back a little bit earlier and let's talk about what are the things that actually drove you into becoming a hardware and software engineer at Dell and also contributed to the things that you're building and the things that you're contributing now.
I was a spoiled child. I was lucky enough that the three siblings I have are 10, 13, and 14 years older. And as such, they were more like aunts and uncles in a way than siblings. But they took care of me and in large part raised me. And their idea of toys would be go out and buy some busted electronics and give me a screwdriver and a hammer and let me take it apart. And if they would give me things to take apart, I was endlessly fascinated. I was one of those rather play with the cardboard box than the toy kid. Eventually I graduated past hammer and flathead screwdriver as chisel for my only tool and got erector sets and chemistry sets. And, they continued to feed that interest in me, that things are made of parts and parts can be made into other things. And they really gifted me with this idea that everything out here in the world is made of parts that can be used for other things and taken apart and do new things. My brother would buy Revell model kits, that you'd build, but he'd buy 2 or 3 of them and take all the parts and mix them up and say, let's make something new. So I really give them a lot of credit for giving me permission to view the world as something that I had agency in and could play with and take apart. And that drove my interest all my life. I've always been very curious how things work. I've been, to my detriment in some cases, my motto all my life, it turns out, has always been, how hard can it be? Even when I repeatedly find out that in fact it's really hard, or that's very difficult, or it takes skills, or you have to learn something. But I was lucky enough to get a good education, and I know how to learn things. My siblings also, made sure that I understood when I was in school that the goal wasn't to memorize. The goal wasn't to just pass a test. The goal was to learn how to learn so that you could be on your own journey of, I'm interested in this, I can go teach myself. And I think that's a gift too, because a lot of people never get that when they're in school. Their goal is to get through school. My goal was to learn how to acquire knowledge. And I used to say that collecting hobbies was my hobby, but that just made my wife afraid I was going to spend way too much money. So I changed it to skills acquisition as my hobby in life. And truthfully, that's, I've always been interested in collecting knowledge. There's just so many fascinating things.
If I look at your bio on QRZ, you have a kind of a short bio on QRZ, and then you have a paragraph at the bottom that has about 2,000 words in it of things that you do. And so looking at that would make me think that this is a kid who couldn't stay in his seat in school, on the one hand, because you've done everything from mastering martial arts forms. We'll talk more about some of the other things that you do, jumping out of airplanes, flying parasails. This is an ADHD kid on the one hand, but you've also gotten yourself a college degree in engineering, perhaps?
Experimental neuropsych, actually.
Really? Oh, how interesting.
I took a weird turn in college for a while. Almost went down a very different path in life.
So then how did you end up becoming a hardware engineer at Dell?
So the only course I failed, and it was a pass-fail course, really in my life, was Introduction to Computers in college. It was due to a redhead. I was intentionally distracted and completely just blew the course off and lost it. I had a National Merit Scholarship, and I just took overloads every semester and just thought I should try everything. And eventually my scholarship committee called me in and said, you're not leaving until you tell us what you graduate. And they seemed really stern and wouldn't let me sit down because I had changed majors like 5 times. And I said, what am I the closest in? It turns out I had been working in a lab for a psych professor who had a sleep study lab and an acoustic chamber with complete isolation. And I had been fixing all his equipment and doing my own biofeedback research. And I didn't know he'd been giving me credit. And so it turned out I had all this extra credit in experimental psych. And then I started working for him. I worked as a stagehand for the union, and I worked for him as the way I worked for my income in college, and managed to put in enough hours that I was able to graduate with a major in experimental psych, focusing on neuropsychology, and then a minor in anthropology, which, if we get into that, that's family history. I have another sideline as an archaeologist because my family has a archaeology relationship. But in any event, I went off into the world and worked as an archaeologist, worked as a photographer, worked in food service, worked as a union stagehand. I thought the goal was to try everything. And then when I had moved to Austin, Texas, I was playing in a band. I had worked at Whole Foods. I was in one of the original Whole Foods here in Austin as a produce team leader. And I had left that job and was doing nothing but playing music and living at a friend's house who was an engineer at Dell. He was making so much money. He was just like, everybody come live at my house. It's fine. And his girlfriend, who he'd sent to Europe to travel around because engineer, came back to the States and saw me and was like, who are you? I'm Tim. Do you have a job? I cleaned a studio. A job. My buddy Dave was like, you need a job. Well, hook me up, And so it took a year to get on at Dell. because I had no computer background. I had electronics hobbyist experience. And as soon as I thought I'd go to work for Dell, I started trying to teach myself. I had learned Fortran in grade school as part of a accelerated program. I was in a thing called PATS, the Program for Academically Talented Students. And they take all the courses they wanted to teach at the junior college and teach them to us first, like fifth graders. And if we did okay with them, then they went on and added them to the curriculum at the junior college. And so I had a basic understanding of computers and programming. So I taught myself assembly, I taught myself C, and every time I'd come back for another interview at Dell, I'd have some shareware I'd released, or I had a board that I'd redesigned. And I had met a lot of the hardware engineers through my buddy. And one of them was the VP of engineering at Dell. And he was like, yeah, you should come work for me. This will be great. This will be great. It'll be a lot of fun. And every time I'd go interview with somebody, HR would say, not a chance, not a chance. Doesn't have any background. No way, you can't hire him. And I think I got through like 12 interviews. They kept trying. To their credit, my buddy kept trying to get me in there. And the managers would go, yeah, he could do it. And HR would be like, nope, can't do it. And finally, I got my last interview. And it was with the VP of tech support at Dell. And he looks at this list of, interview manager, like, okay, HR, no. Okay, no. Like, what am I supposed to do with you? You're supposed to hire me. And I said, tell you what, because at this point, I just needed a job. I didn't care. I said, you hire me for half what you're paying anybody in here. And if in 6 months, you don't want to promote me to, the highest level in your tech support group, then no harm, no foul, part ways. You don't even have to pay me benefits until then. It's like, okay, yeah. And 6 months later, I got promoted out of tech support into engineering and started working and doing board respins and DLL rewrites. And Dell was a meritocracy those days. Michael Dell hadn't graduated from University of Texas. And so there weren't a lot of barriers and they would feed interest. They would, reward effort. And so I did 5 years at Dell from 1989 to 1994 and just learned so much stuff and ended up falling out. I did hardware for about 2 of those years and was loving it, but I don't know. And there's a gravity to software, and I tripped up and fell into the software side of things and never left.
So that's what you're doing now?
Yeah, professionally right now, I'm the executive vice president of IT for Court Business Services, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company. The main line of the business is furniture rental, mostly like furnished apartments and trade shows and events and things like that. It's mostly commercial. There's residential as well, but it's a just on the edge of Fortune 500 size company. So enterprise IT, I had gotten out of enterprise IT for a while, gone into speech writing and video production. I went to work for a PR firm. Was having the time of my life, but it turns out good PR money is weak IT money. And at that point, I had had a kid and really just needed to, have a good, solid, earning potential. So I went back into IT. The court's been phenomenal to me. I've been there, 13 years.
Well, just so I don't feel bad, how do you do on math? How was your calculus, your differential equations?
My math is spotty. I'm very strong in statistics, and I'm a database. In my organization, so I run the software development, the business analysts, and the network operations groups. And it's a requirement in my organization that every manager be an individual contributor as well. I just don't think you can be a good manager in IT or tech if you don't have some chops of your own. So my role is the senior database architect. So in areas like statistics, Boolean algebra, logic, that's my bread and butter every day. In areas like linear algebra, I'm solid and functional. In areas like calculus, I'm constantly going back to the book. I think I used those neurons for something else some time ago and haven't figured out how to put it back in. Trig and calculus just don't show up in my problem set very often, which is frustrating because they're great tools. So every 2 years I make another run at it and I sit down and try and refresh it all. But I need something to do with it,
But you took away their risk. So it was easy for them to say, okay, well, there's no risk here. He doesn't want the benefit package, right?
I said, I figured for me, it was all win. If nothing else, I got 6 months of work. It'd be awesome. And they gave me a logic analyzer, which was super awesome.
And now this message from ICOM America. ICOM wants to wish you a very happy 2021. This happiness should include hours of fun and enjoyment with the new ICOM IC705 portable transceiver. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick for amateurs that enjoy operating any mode both indoors and outdoors. It is the perfect QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in just over 2 pounds. The ICOM IC705 has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 MHz. Its other features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, or 10 watts with a 13.8 volts DC from an external power source. Operating modes include single sideband CW, AM, FM, digital modes, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot. The HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment and included in the box. The IC705 supports QRP and QRPP operations. And the perfect accessory for the IC705 is now available in the LC192 optional backpack that includes a special compartment for your IC705, with room for accessories for soda activation or a day's social distancing in the park. Of course, there is a huge list of available accessories, including cables, batteries, and software listed on the ICOM IC705 website. Folks, this is a fine rig, with many available positive online reviews. It will become the de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operators, and since it now has the RS-BA1 IP-based remote control software, the IC705 will be the first choice as a remote-based rig. You owe it to yourself to make the ICOM IC705 your transceiver of choice for the new year. Be sure to click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page for more information on this amazing rig. But once you do that, be sure to call your favorite ICOM dealer to place your order. The ICOM IC705 is in stock and shipping today. And when you do that, please be sure to tell your dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. Thanks as always to ICOM for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Be sure to visit www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on other ICOM radios as well. And now back to our QSO. Let's move up a little bit, because if anybody looks for you on YouTube, they're going to find that you're into a lot of interesting things. But the biggest takeaway about Tim Deagan is that you're a builder, and you're not limited to one media, which is also very interesting. What I remember growing up is, at least my dad and my grandfather, they were all builders. We had the wood shop, metal shop, and auto shop in the garage. And during the 60s and 70s, that seemed to be very common that people worked in their garages and built stuff. I don't see that very much anymore.
You know, it's funny. My social community is primarily the Burning Man community. There are a lot of folks in that world who have studios, shop, makerspace, things like that. So, you know, there are parts, the maker movement has reinvigorated that for an awful lot of folks. And it's broken down some of the barriers, because, you know, the spaces that you described were primarily aggressively gendered. I mean, those were male environments for the most part. A lot of what's going on now really sort of stretches out and expands the definition so that, you know, under the maker umbrella, you might be a textile maker. That is, you might be into embroidery, computer embroidery, costuming, cosplay. So I think the definitions of maker have tried, not always successfully, to become more inclusive, and opened up a lot of spaces that, you know, there have been a lot of gendered making spaces throughout time. My mother had a sewing room. There's more collaboration and crossover now than there ever has been. And I think that's an important thing for ham radio too. I think the constant lament of how do we bring new people? How do we expand the, you know, diversity of who's in ham radio? I think there are some movements that offer some suggestion.
So you've got this amazing ham station, but if I look on YouTube, it's just so much more than that. So how did that start for you?
I'm an obsessive tool collector for one thing. So every time I sort of discover a new tool, I just become obsessed with what can you do? What can I do if I had that? And that'll keep me up at night until I find a way to acquire it. So some years ago, just so I didn't feel bad about household income, I started writing for various tech magazines. And I used that income to fund a cycle of write an article, buy a tool, write an article about the tool, get another check, buy another tool. And I'm primarily interested in fabrication tools. I have a plasma CNC. I have a router CNC. I have, a couple of filament 3D printers, resin 3D printer, MIG, TIG, arc, stick, gas, welding, lathe, mill. I mean, anything that allows you to make things from stock or modify things starts getting my interest. I get really curious. And so I always sort of I get so obsessed with like, what would the possibilities be if I owned this tool? And it's turned out over the years that the reality is I'm far, far more interested in the experience of learning the tool than I am in like just having it and making stuff with it forever. I mean, my fantasy is that I'm going to work up. I've got a project in my head that if I can ever really get everything organized, it'll use everything in the shop. And that's kind of like that'll be my masterpiece. And it's not the masterpiece of the final built thing. For me, it's the masterpiece because I managed to use like every tool in my shop to make it. That would be just so exciting to me.
When you say stock, you're talking tubes, bars, rods.
Yeah, I liked, it's really exciting. I mean, a lot of people who, have lathes and mills and like that, their joy comes from making their own things. And a lot of things that interest them are things that, you look out there, you could go buy it, but they would rather make it. And that's a great, maker thing. If I can buy something, I'm rarely interested in making it myself. Unless it's just crazy. I'd rather make things you can't buy. I'd rather, I make a lot of what I make on my tools is mundane because it's all brackets and cases to fit things that I can't buy that bracket or case. It's mounting systems. It's specialty frames. It's, joints and swivels. Like I've really been struggling. I want to get into, I have all the gear to do VHF, UHF satellite contacts, but it's freaky unergonomic. I mean, it's just really, I don't know if that's an area you're into, but it's really frustrating to have something that's happening as fast as that require you to be holding this and switching. And so there's a more ergonomic way to do this. And it doesn't necessarily mean backing out of it altogether and just using a rotator. I mean, there's got to be a way. So I've 3D printed a lot of parts to try and build new, semi-equatorial mounts to try and take one piece of the motion out. Right now the whole thing's mounted. My whole rig is mounted on a piece of unistrut so I can hold it like a bazooka. So it's got balance behind me.
Maybe you could use something like, what is it, a handy cam?
Like the balanced.
Right, so that you're not spending so much time dealing with the weight or the torque.
And so that I can't buy that.
No, you'd have to make that.
I'd have to make that. And so that's the exciting thing. I get a problem like that. I want to solve it. I spend a lot of time in 3D CAD. I work all my ideas out in 3D CAD.
3D CAD is the program?
3D CAD's a technology. I use Fusion 360 as my primary design tool. It's got sheet metal folding. It's got mesh. It's got BREP. It's got all the techniques I need. It's a great program, although they've recently changed the license and we could have an hour and a half of deep conversation about the value of Fusion 360, but I'll try not to pull my own string on that. But yeah, I'm always interested in making things I just can't get anywhere else. That's primarily what drives, and then scale. I've always had a limited amount of space for my various shops. And so I've always had to buy tools that were scaled small. And I'm really I would like to have the opportunity to work larger because I would really like to build bigger things.
You're working in a standard 20 by 20 garage right now, would you say?
Yeah, it's a 2-car garage. It's a little bit, the dimensions are just slightly over 20 by 20, but I have all of it. I don't have to share it with
So do you have a warehouse someplace that you could work in?
I don't. I have friends who have warehouses that I used to occasionally use for large scale things, but the 2020 kind of put a stopper on that. There's the burner community in Austin has a warehouse that's for big builds, and I have access to that. And then I have other friends who have like pole barns that I can use. And then I use my yard a lot. My poor neighbors, they're endlessly curious and a little terrified. A lot of my things as I'm working out ideas, especially the ones that involve a lot of propane, it's reasonable. If I were my neighbor, I would ask a lot of questions.
That's why I'm asking questions today. I read that you're a licensed flame effects operator.
Yes.
I'm going to put a link to the YouTube video of you igniting your projects.
Cool.
What is a licensed flame effects operator?
So in the United States, it varies state to state what the various licenses are. In Texas, there are a set of licenses. There are 2 licenses for dealing with pyrotechnics, that is fireworks. They call them the small and the large. And then there's 1 license, which is the flame effect operator license, because legally any flame that's being displayed before an audience, whether it's a candle on a stage on a play or a giant row of 50 massive fire cannons at a concert, has to be permitted and under the responsibility of a state licensed flame effect operator. So you have to take a test. It's on NFPA 160, which is the standard for flame effects before an audience, and then a few other state regs. And then once you've got that, you can take out permits with the fire marshal and handle the inspections and occasionally get away with having inappropriate stuff at your house. I probably have slightly more propane cylinders than most people would have at their house.
Without being in the propane cylinder business.
Without being in the propane cylinder business, yes.
How did the special effects with propane? It sounds to me you were a stage manager. You've been in stagecraft for years and years. Was it just the market demand for flames that kind of sucked you in?
Well, I would go to big events outside, art festivals, Burning Man events, things like that. And these fire artists would just, be amazing. I mean, it's such a visceral experience. If you've ever been around big fire art, I mean, you smell it, you feel it. In a lot of cases, you can taste it. It's a sensory overload experience. I had been a volunteer firefighter. I've always had a lifelong fascination with fire. You'll find that a significant percentage of all firefighters, volunteer or professional, really like fire, just are entranced by it. And when I started looking at what the flame effects artists were doing with either propane cannons or some cases burn barrel type art, sculpture, again, I got hit with how hard can it be? And that turned out to be a real journey because while there are some centers of it, like if you're in San Francisco, pretty easy to go learn how to do this stuff. You can go apprentice with some existing fire artists, but I really didn't have that opportunity here. So I kept trying to figure out how to do it. And eventually, I'm not uncomfortable working within regulations or standard. Now, a lot of fire artists are like, hey, I'm blowing stuff up. Who cares about regs? Not my best approach to things. So I went and read the regulations and understood them and started building things that ideally I wanted, even though I was showing them at events where they weren't having to be permitted, I wanted to be able to get them permitted because I wanted to do it more places. And eventually this led to 2 directions for me that opened up a lot of doors. One was I became the flame and safety officer for Maker Faire Austin. And so I got involved with a lot of other people's fire art as well. And then 2, I got a contract to write a book for Make Magazine for their publishing arm, which is Make Fire, the Art and Science of Working with Propane, which was the first book, the only book written on how to build big flame cannon style effects, which was very controversial in the community when I did it, but has turned out to be very well received. It's a great book. I'm real proud of it because it's sort of connected me to so many fire artists. I've kind of gotten to, godfather, dozens and dozens of flame art projects around the world. So
when you talk about flame art, it'll be kind of obvious, I think, once people see the YouTube video of your performing music to the side of this thing that only is reminiscent of the Wizard of Oz, seeing the wizard. But there appears to be a fair amount of electronics involved. What do you have going there? It also appears like you have a whole percussion system that is also running on its own. What's that about?
So when you're building fire art, you kind of have to decide what is going to be your shtick. I mean, you can build generic stuff, but I'm interested in building my stuff. And instead of choosing the route that many, many fire artists do, which is how big a fireball can I make in the sky? I mean, it's not that hard to make a 20-foot diameter fireball, but you can make a 60-foot diameter fireball if you really want to work at it. And lots of people go that direction. I'm much more interested in controlling fire and using digital control to do interesting pattern play with it. And so the effect that you're referencing is called Boosh Beats. Boosh is the sort of onomatopoeia term for flame cannons here in Texas. Other places they call them poofers, but they don't call them that in Texas. They call them Boosh. And so I use Arduinos typically. I've used other microcontrollers, but everybody uses Arduinos now. And I've got inputs so I can accept MIDI in, I can accept DMX in, I can accept direct parallel, like 8-channel control in, and you can also play it directly on the controller. And there's also an 8-step sequencer I built. So I wanted to build a MIDI flame drum machine. That was the goal. And so the fire that's being shot out, it's high pressure propane being released at volume through a pilot light. So it makes a big fireball. But in this case, about 3 to 4 feet in front of the jet, I've put a 3-foot disc of steel. So when the fireball hits it, it sprays out in a flat circle. And so it makes a much bigger, and it's a really interesting pattern. It looks coronal. It looks like when you see the sun during an eclipse, you see the flames around the edge, but there's a black center. And it makes a sound because thump. So I built this thing and I was playing it by myself. And there was another group who I'm a huge fan of called Pony Trap. It's a husband and wife team. They build giant drum robots. He's a phenomenal viola player. She's a cello player, but they play like their own heavy metal cello viola combinations with robot drummers that are just playing maniacally. And I had said, hey, would you come do a set with me? Please, 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 because you're so cool. And they're like, with fire? And so we ended up doing, in one weekend, we did, I think it was 23 sets together. I burned through like 400 pounds of propane. We're all besties now. So it was a lot of fun because I was able to take output from his rig. I took a 8-channel output from his robots and was able to interface it into my box because I built it to be able to interface easily. And so he was able to drive my 8 flame effects. There's 8 different, fire jets in the effect as if they were his drums. And he did it in conjunction with his drums. So the combination, I was just completely blown away by the whole experience. And the next flame effect, the one I'm in the process of building now, takes that idea and instead of having a row of 8 flame effects, mounts the 8 flame effects in a large truss circle so that they can do inwards, they can do crosses, they can do patterns around, they can do, all at once in. So, I really want to keep exploring not just big boosh, but, patterned, interesting boosh. Some of the most amazing experiences I've had with fire effect happened with tiny little fireballs just being done at the right time and right place.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George KJ8U, Jeremy KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. Let's circle back a little bit to amateur radio, because we're talking to an amateur radio audience, and it's okay. Because there's some things that you're saying here that are interesting to me from the standpoint that you were able to fund your interest, the project, by writing an article about it. So it seems to me that that's a very good foundation for creating an opportunity to learn something new.
Yeah.
So contributing to a magazine. Which magazines, by the way, did you contribute to?
My primary relationship is with Make magazine. I've written for a number of software magazines over the years, Database Advisor, Lotus Notes Advisor, a variety of other those. I used to write for Nuts and Bolts magazine back in the 90s and 2000. But Make and I have had a really strong relationship. At this point, I haven't had an article pitch turned down by them in about 3 years.
So you get an idea for a tool that you'd like to have. And you could tell me a little bit about what a plasma CNC machine is, because that sounds pretty amazing. So first of all, you have this desire that you'd like to have a plasma CNC machine, and so that you must have to, in order to write the article, it could be a review on the tool, but it could also be using the tool to create something. So what approach did you take in order to create a magazine article on the plasma CNC?
Yeah, I got, it's funny because in the 90s, I primarily sold reviews, and, they're just not, I get too excited about things. It's hard for me to be critical. And, to be a good reviewer, you need to show the bald spots as well as the beauty. So I like to do project. And most of what I sell right now are what are called skill builder articles. They're not necessarily focused on the tool so much as the skill of using the tool. And the way I do it is I write an article about the last tool I bought to buy the next tool. So the plasma CNC, which is a relatively recent acquisition, I'm still trying to decide which article to sell about that. I sold an article about my other CNC, which is a router-based CNC. And let me make, so the distinction is when you say CNC, which means computer numeric control, it just basically says you've got a computer that's driving a tool to do something.
Right, up and down or right or left, X, Y, Z.
Typically, they're in a Cartesian model that is an X, Y, Z. There are other designs. There are polar. There are deltas. There's a variety of things. But whether it's a 3D printer, a vinyl cutter, actually a computer printer, any of these are just, you've got some tool head that you're moving under your control, typically with G code, but not exclusively.
I've seen CNC machines that look like subway cars, that have some kind of a lathe or router or something like that in it, right? With water and the whole 9 yards. That's not what we're talking about here at this point.
Well, at the sort of archetypal level, it is in that it's still just a tool head that you've taken a 3D file. You've taken that 3D file and fed it through some process that generates movement commands. And then those movement commands are given to the motor set that moves that around and then turns it on. So if you've got a router that's under its control, you're going to, control the speed that the router's moving at, and you're going to move it in XYZ to cut whatever you want to cut. Or maybe it's using a drag knife, so it's cutting vinyl. Or maybe it's a laser, because I have a laser. I fabricated my own laser mount. I have a 15-watt laser mounted to my CNC head, so I can do burning and things like that, engraving with the laser.
So what we're talking about is actually the cutting head.
Yes. So it's a plasma cutter under the control of the motors from the computer. And so where the router works great with, it'll do aluminum, but it doesn't really like metal. I mean, you don't want to use a router on much more than just aluminum. You can, but it's a big, plexiglass, plastics, woods, cloth, leather, all those are great on the router CNC. But if you want to cut metal and you want to have the metal cut to, exotic shapes and sizes like that, you really need a plasma torch. And so the plasma torch is the same process of moving it in. It's typically what they call 2.5D. It's just X and Y and on or off, because the nice plasma cutters will move them up and down, but usually not during the, and so, I bought a really nice, low end plasma cutter that will cut, up to 1/2-inch steel. And so it's been phenomenal for making brackets and mounts and, parts that you can't buy them. You got to make them. It cuts aluminum, brass, steel, anything the plasma cutter will cut through, which is pretty much any metal. So that's exciting because it took me from just sort of soft materials on the regular CNC to, metal that I can fabricate in custom fashion on the plasma CNC. So it extended my range in the shop tremendously. And then using my regular welding tools, I could take the parts that I cut out on the plasma CNC and weld them into, whatever fabricated design I'm interested in. And that's turning out to be really exciting in antenna building, because it's giving me the opportunity to, cut specialty brackets and mounts and clamps and things like that. So, I've used my 3D printers in ham radio all the time, tons of stuff printed for ham radio. I've used my CNC to cut some plexiglass things, mostly cases for like kit radios that I'm building and things like that. But more and more, I'm finding opportunities to, actually I used it I was building a Moxon antenna, and you've got to have the spacing where the wires come to just so. So I was able to cut plexiglass spacers just right and things like that. So standoffs that are exotic in shape or something like that. So all these tools, can be used for anything. For me right now in 2020, they've more or less all been aimed at ham radio. So, once you've got a fabrication set, I just think it opens up opportunities in any hobby that you're interested in.
I'm looking again at your background here. Ham radio appears everything's on. It looks like you're active. So you haven't abandoned the propane, but how much is amateur radio now playing in your maker experience?
I've probably dedicated 80% of my 2020 interest. So I got my technician's license in 95. But I really didn't do anything with it for a long time. Once packet wasn't that interesting, I just didn't have a lot of interest in UHF, VHF repeater activity. I never made a connection with the local community because I'm just not that into rag chewing. I would occasionally go to a swap meet or something because of the gear. But it wasn't until 2020 when I got really interested in emergency communications again, because it was difficult at the beginning of the year to see how bad the year might get. And I'm a, be prepared kind of guy. And so I decided to go get my general and upgrade. And at the beginning of the year, I upgraded to general, which gave me HF privileges, and bought my first HF radio, which is a Zygu G90, which is a lovely little radio, but it's only 20 watts. So I was, at the high end of the QRP world. So pretty soon I bought an ICOM IC735, a 1980s rig that, was lovely, but I was lusting after an IC7300. So I sold a couple articles, sold an article on MIDI for makers, and invoiced a couple old articles, and bought the IC7300, which is just, everybody buys them and they're just lovely, and I have nothing but good things to say about it. But, then I like to make things, and I didn't get to make my 7300. So I started buying kit radios. This is a QRP Labs QCX plus CW rig. I have another whisper beacon that I'm putting up. I'm going to put a whisper beacon up on a 20 meter vertical dipole out in the yard. So it's running because I'm very interested. See, I think there's propagation hams and there's conversation hams. And of course it's a spectrum. People fall along there. I'm way more on the propagation ham side of things. My enthusiasm about ham radio is, and this is the thing, radio is magic. Really, when you get down to what's going on with it, what's happening, it's amazing. It's magic. If you took a 5-watt flashlight outside, and you can buy a 5-watt flashlight for nothing, right? You can go outside. If you walked outside at night and flicked it at the clouds, and somebody in, Budapest looks up at the clouds and is able to discern the flickering that you made of that flashlight in Austin, Texas, and derive information with it. And that's not that far off from what you're doing with a whisper, radio at 5 watts that's, bouncing off the ionosphere 4 or 5 times to make it to Budapest. And you're doing it with all these other signals are out there. That's amazing. Radio is just magic. I'm reading right now, at the request of a friend, I bought this 1943 Elements of Radio. It's a World War II. So you used to work on a farm and you're going to be a radio operator now book. And it takes you step by step through the history, the pieces and parts. And so I don't know, I took us off track here for a moment, but I get excited about things, which is why I do them, because I like that experience. And, fire gets me interested because it's so visceral and it's so primal. And when it happens, you just get this rush of, wow, that's cool. Radio and ham radio, I'm just in awe of an electromagnetic field. What is that really? And it turns out that I'm very lucky. One of my best friends here in Austin is a PhD physicist who designed railguns for a living. So he's like very strong on magnetism and electricity. And the poor guy, he gets a call from me about twice a week. I'm like, okay. So if magnetic fields are generated by an electron, charged particle moving, how come the charged particles that are moving while we orbit around the sun aren't generating, questions that are not necessarily well formed, but it's led me into, a deeper and just expanded my awe.
I've said this probably in a couple of earlier episodes, so I beg the forgiveness of my listeners. But if you go back into old QST magazines, all the way into the late 40s, 50s, you always have this lament about how we're just not attracting enough people to amateur radio. There's just not enough hams. Tim, what are we doing wrong? And maybe we're always going back to the same water hole for new hams, but they're not there. Maybe they're someplace else. What do you think we're doing and where we should go to look for new hams?
I think about this a lot because this is also a problem in the maker community and maker fairs. I mean, the issue exists in a lot of places, and I would love to see ham radio really reach the breadth of its audience. When I talk to 20-somethings about ham radio, I get a couple of different responses pretty consistently. One is new. I think one is very interesting. We now live in a culture where privacy is a big deal. And the way a lot of people describe ham radio is self-doxing. And if you know the term doxing somebody, it's an internet term for putting all their information, contact information online, which is considered a bad thing. In ham radio, you self-dox. You register with the FCC and your name and address are available for everybody to find. And I talk to a lot of young women who are really intelligent, and they have no interest whatsoever in having their street address available to anybody. And so there's a privacy issue that's emerged that I hadn't anticipated. So that's one. Two, this is a disposable income hobby. It is very difficult to, if you don't have an income stream available to go spend on stuff, you can get into VHF, UHF. Really.
You can get into HF really cheap with a QCX.
Yeah. The challenge with that is that when you go that direction, and that's what happened to me with the G90, beautiful radio. But if at the beginning, the first thing you're doing is entering QRP ham radio, as opposed to the main, because QRP is a niche. I mean, it's a powerful niche. There's a lot of people, but there's a lot you need to know. I mean, you're not going to have the experience that people sort of, treasure in mainstream ham radio if you don't know how to tweak and get because QRP is about, wringing the best out of very little. And you don't find that out in your general test, how to do that. I mean, that takes experience and time and investment of effort. So it's tough to get a 5-watt radio and feel like you're talking to the world. Not impossible, but it's tough. I will tell you, I do believe that DMR, D-Star, System Fusion, and those directions have a huge opportunity to bring new hams into the hobby. You can get on for very little. You can get on a DMR or a D-Star radio. Say your call sign and start talking to somebody from Indonesia or Israel or London. I mean, and it's clear as a bell. So if you're interested in the conversation end of the spectrum in ham radio, I think DMR, D-Star, System Fusion really open up a lot of possibilities, because what it offers is what they tried to do on the internet with things like chat roulette. People are very interested in talking to strangers. Oddly enough, it's not my primary enthusiasm in life, but a lot of people like that. They like that, meeting new people and having that conversation, which is one of the best things that goes on ham radio. You don't know somebody, but you start talking to them and you discover all this interesting stuff. But that's because there's a lot of gatekeepers. And that gatekeeping is the license. If I go on ham radio and I call CQ and somebody comes up, the odds are, or I go on the DMR radio and I start talking, the odds are that I'm not going to, they're not going to try and sell me something. They're not going to stalk me. They're not going to be, weird. They're going to have at least some interests in common. And so there's a basis for safety. Chat roulette, which was a thing on the internet where you can go and just open up somebody else's webcam and start talking, immediately descended into, odd, weird, uncomfortable situations and people selling things. But there's that interest. People want to do that. And I think ham radio's long history of having a very accessible gatekeeping. That is, you got to know enough of what you're doing to get your license. But that license process isn't limited to, it's not difficult. With a little, anybody should be able to get a technician's class license. I think anybody can do that. And the accessibility to do that is fairly strong. We just need to make sure that having done that, the value proposition in that is very clear. If you grew up around hams, you went to field days as a kid, you did things like that, you know what you want to do when you get there. If you've only barely heard of it, it can look intimidating. There's a lot of, if buttons and knobs don't excite you, for me, I would be in ham radio even if I didn't have a license, just because I like all the buttons, knobs, and blinky lights.
Right, I do too. You mentioned earlier that you think that there's two kinds of hams. There's rag-chewing hams and propagation hams. And with your background in the maker community, because one of the reasons that we're talking is because I somehow have this idea that maybe the maker community is the barrel we should be looking in for creating a new class of hams. What about doing something as a maker project for the propagation hams, or people that don't know that they would be propagation hams, but an Arduino-based or Raspberry Pi-based whisper transmitter with that 20-meter antenna on the roof as a way to see, well, where does my signal go? Then use the internet to go look at the whisper site and see where that signal went and who heard it, just as a way to excite that interest.
I 100% agree with you. I spend most of my time on the radio on FT. And I hear all the laments about FTA. It's like, oh, it's ham radio. And how do you know who you're talking to? It's like, well, you don't. It's not that type of ham radio. There's other things for that. This is a video game with the ionosphere as a controller. And the excitement isn't just, running WJST and making the CQs. It's watching pskreporter.info and seeing who heard you. And so, my experience with running FT8 is that, it's a computer mediated experience, which isn't appealing to many hams, but is appealing to a lot of 20 something and, people who grew up in the internet age. It used to be the entree to ham radio was you were a kid who liked electronics. Well, where's the entree into ham radio for kids who grew up on the internet, maybe writing some software or playing with Arduinos? And I think that comes in, the DMR world, that's mediated largely by hotspot and the software written on them. It's a Raspberry Pi for most people who are putting in that. There's a lot of kids out there who have played with Raspberry Pis pretty extensively, and they've got some chops. They can do amazing things. And when you look at the kinds of things that are new in ham radio, they're exciting. They're SDRs, they're FT8, they're software media. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks who didn't come from a, analog electronics background, which is increasingly rare. I always called myself an electronics guy, but I only did digital electronics. Frankly, the upgrade to general was the first time in my life I ever really tried to take analog electronics seriously. For me, a capacitor, was a decoupling cap and a resistor was for pull down. Everything else was done, pretty much either with a MOSFET or a microcontroller. And now, I bought the attic from a Silent Keys estate, and I ended up with this huge truckload of stuff. So now, I'm spending my days learning, what do I do with these?
What you're holding up is some very large high voltage butterfly capacitor. On the other hand, you have a roller inductor.
Yes.
Beautifully made that would cost you hundreds of dollars if you had to buy it today.
This, my big, ginormous variable, 7,000 volt variable cap, is going to be turned into a 40-meter, 100-watt mag loop antenna.
But you don't want to put that near the propane tanks in the yard.
No, No, this will be 33 foot up in the air with a servo motor driven control on it, so I can do it remote. Yeah, and I ended up with, dozens and dozens of tubes and 8 or 9 of these various types of, large scale, high voltage. It was all 1960s and 70s stuff that went back to the 1930s. So, I wouldn't have had the first clue or interest about this until I took my general. And the reason I upgraded to extra was because I decided I am going to take analog electronics seriously. I really am going to try to understand what is that merry dance of capacitance and inductance? What does impedance mean? Because, those kinds of things really drive your ability to go to the next level with your rig or do creative things with it. And I didn't have that knowledge. If I couldn't do it with a microcontroller, I might brute force it. But now it's like I've always had a fairly well outfitted, test bench, but now it includes an, LCR meter and good signal generators and things like that as well. So that's my quest, is to become fully conversant in analog electronics. And ham radio, hardly a better opportunity in, this decade to pursue any interest in analog electronics. It's either ham radio or modular synths, and modular synths are even more expensive than ham radio. So
now you have a family, wife and children. You mentioned that in your website. How do they play with Tim? Do they come into the shop? Do they build with you? Or do they just say, that's Dad in the garage?
That's Dad. I'll fix things for them. They know that, I'm a better partner to everybody when I'm enthusiastic. And the way I maintain my enthusiasm is having problems to solve and getting to make things. I get a little awkward to be around if I don't make something every now and then, because I get all antsy and I start looking at parts of the house and wondering what it would be like to take them apart. As it turns out, I've learned my lesson there. There are many things in life you just want to leave alone. Don't take apart the AC.
Your children, any of them are makers?
No, very creative. I have one kid, daughter. She's phenomenally creative. She's an unbelievable musician. She's a great writer. Incredibly verbal, but her interests are in the language and music. My wife's a psychotherapist. She's phenomenally creative in the life of the mind, emotional intelligence. They're very supportive of me, but it's all it's a separate world. So it would be that's one of my sort of wouldn't it be wonderful if, but on the other hand, I don't have to share. So
I'm also married to someone who's so different from me that she's given me my own space, and she kind of hopes that I outlive her from the standpoint of having to clean things up.
Yeah, luckily nobody has to clean my shop but me.
Do you think that you've been involved in the hobby long enough to have an idea of what you think the greatest challenge that we have as amateur radio operators now?
Yeah, I mean, the greatest challenge, I think, is a conjunction of associated problems. The ARRL here in the United States is fighting the FCC's removal of one of the band areas, I think it's 3.5 gig, that hams have. The cost of spectrum these days makes what the ham community has access to freakish. It would be very easy for hams to lose a lot of what they have if they don't use it. It's one of those things, if you aren't there, if you aren't using it, if you aren't expanding it, why shouldn't they sell it for lease it for billions of dollars to somebody else? And so I think that the problems with the ham community are both that, communications as an aspect of our culture, which has been growing for, 150, 200 years, is now going into hyperdrive. It's an exponential curve. I mean, the amount of investment in communications or digital information just is so wildly greater than it was 20 years ago that it's going to start to compete with hams, and hams are going to have to state their value proposition. So, the mission of ham radio, of experimentation and communications and emergency communications, really has to be represented well. And I think that representation is also part of the problem with why don't we get as many new hams. Now, I think that there's going to be a reassessment to a degree here at the, in the next year, because if I don't have any official metrics, but if you look at things like the rate at which vanity call signs are being claimed, the rate at which ham radio gear is back ordered and unavailable, The number of people you hear on the radio saying, I've just upgraded to general, or this is my first contact. 2020, people's social isolation has been a huge shot in the arm for ham radio. A lot of activity, a lot more people who have thought about it, a lot of people who have come back to the hobby. If some momentum from that can be maintained, and there's a big injection of new technology at the same time, all the SDR radios. I mean, an IC7300 for the price it's at, what it provides, that's a game changer. And that's just the first of a wave of, new equipment that's going to make it easier and more exciting to be on the radio. I mean, I know that there's a vintage allure to spinning the dial and listening for whispers in the ether. But there's another allure of looking at a waterfall and saying, what are they doing? What's going on over there? What's happening to, that part of the band? I mean, that's my frustration of ham radio, is that I'm missing something, and the waterfall says I am. And so I got to keep, coming back to it. That's a great, sort of encouragement cycle that I think we need to have more of. So I just think that ham radio has to let go of the idea. I mean, the people who lament what's going on at ham radio are not a diverse group of folk. And I'm right there with them. I'm a AARP white male with disposable income. I mean, is this hobby just for me? And if it's not, there's got to be other ways in.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Treasure your sense of awe and wonder. It's nice. I don't get me wrong. A lot of people are very enthusiastic about rag chewing and doing nets and all that. And I participate in nets. Shout out to the rare ones in New Orleans. That's my nightly net. But the wonder of it all, what's happening. I mean, what it's doing, that you're tickling the ionosphere in a relationship with the solar wind, and, you're using, electromagnetic waves that really aren't anything at all, but still affect everything. There's just so much joy and wonder in the way the world is made that I think ham radio gives you access to play with that otherwise isn't available. So I just think that, don't just think about the gear. Don't just think about the people. That's all wonderful. And that's a great encouraging thing, but take a moment and think about the stuff they were asking on the exams, because the questions about propagation and all that, there's mysteries and wonderment behind all that I lay in bed at night and try and picture how all this works. And, it's a reverie for me. It's a real joy. So that would be my recommendation is, be open to the wonder.
Tim, this has really been fun, and I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to cross paths again, because I think that you're going to make a lot of amazing contributions to the ham radio hobby, and you'll document it in some way, and we'll enjoy it. So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Tim. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KJ8U in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.